Following the methodology from our best-selling book, The Resilient Shield, we are delighted to announce the inaugural Resilience Retreat, which will occur in far north Queensland between Thursday the 27th of October and Sunday the 30th of October.
The whole point of the retreat is to give you the ability to build your shield, to develop your knowledge and understanding of the key principles related to resilience, to enhance your toolkit and to optimise your performance.
Come and be part of an incredible group of humans that are like-minded, meet our facilitators and motivational speakers. To find out more, email us at retreat@resilientshield.com. Hope to see you there.
Welcome to the Unforgiving 60 with your hosts, Ben Pronk and Tim Curtis. As two ex-SAS guys armed with MBAs, Ben and Tim seek out people leading lives less ordinary and talk with them about how they fill their unforgiving minutes and what helps them go, always, a little further. Like intellectual bowerbirds, we aim to collect shiny little objects of knowledge that we think can help build better humans.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Unforgiving 60 podcast. I'm sitting next to Tim Curtis.
Opposite, actually. G'day, everyone. I'm Tim Curtis.
And I'm Ben Pronk. And we use this podcast to talk to people who are leading lives less ordinary, find out how they're going to fill their unforgiving minutes. And that concept is particularly pertinent to our discussion today with Nir Eyal, who is the author, amongst other books, of the recent work Indistractable. Now, Nir was born in Israel and grew up in Orlando, Florida. He earned a Bachelor of Arts at Emory University. He worked for BCG, top-tier consulting group, Boston Consulting Group, and attended Stanford for his MBA. You ever heard of Stanford?
Yeah, I mean, we cite a lot of work from Stanford professors, don't we? Ali Crum, Andrew Huberman. There's some good stuff coming out of Stanford.
Absolutely. I visited Stanford. Yeah, design school there.
It's going to be a wonderful place of the world.
Yeah, it is. It's a cool part of the world, very interesting and clearly world-leading school. But we're not going to talk to Nir about his Ivy League education. We're going to talk to him about this concept of being indistractable. And I mentioned the unforgiving minute because one of the techniques he's going to talk about is this idea of making sure we have scheduled our unforgiving minute through a technique called time boxing.
Yeah, I like the fact he's also disrupting the norm. He breaks a bit of our paradigm on locus of control, or maybe value adds into it.
Yeah, I think
Put some thoughts into our hands on how we use parts of our neurochemistry as excuses. I kind of like that.
Yeah, I think that was a really crystallising discussion in terms of, are we using this as a crutch or can it help us to understand in order to overcome? Yes, we've got this stuff going on in our brains, but that is not a self-fulfilling prophecy. We are not necessarily slaves to that.
And how do you allocate time for you, for relationships, for work, and make sure all of those things are in balance and in order.
And in that order, yeah, which is a great chat. And finally, I'm interested to ask him about boredom. Does it have its place in a productive and indistractable, time-boxed life?
Well, let's check it out. Let's get on with the show.
So you stand by and watch. You won't make me want to cry. 'Cause in the end you'll feel no pain. There's no afterlife, but the sun shines through the rain. Oh, the sun shines through the rain.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to the Unforgiving 60 podcast. I'm Ben Pronk.
And I'm Tim Curtis.
And Tim, I am going to try and focus. You are often into me about my distractibility, my tiny little attention span, but I'm going to be on my best behaviour today because...
And I just saw a text and an email pop up on your phone.
And I didn't even flit, did I?
I know, it's very good. Good discipline.
I'm in the zone. But the reason I am on my particular best behaviour today is because we're joined by an expert on the topic, Nir Eyal.
Welcome to the show, Nir.
Thank you so much. Great to be here.
Nir, we're really keen to get into the topic of your book, Indistractable, and how we can improve that in our lives. But before we do, it'd be great to give our listeners a bit of background in terms of how you got to where you are today.
Sure. So I'm what you call a behavioral designer. So professionally, I help companies build healthy habits in their customers' lives. So I work with companies in healthcare and financial services and education, all kinds of ways to help people form healthy habits, typically through some kind of tech-enabled product. So my first book was called Hooked: How to Build Habit-Forming Products. And that was all about how do you build good habits because I noticed that there's a flip side to these products that are so wonderful that we like to use them all the time, is that sometimes we overuse things. And what originally started as a personal exploration, I remember I was with my daughter one afternoon, and we had this perfect day plan, some daddy-daughter time. And I remember we had this activity book of different things that dads and daughters could do together. And one of the activities in the book was to ask each other this question: if you could have any superpower, what superpower would you want? Mm-hmm. And I remember that question verbatim, but I can't tell you what my daughter said. Because in that moment, for whatever reason, I don't remember why, I thought it was a good time to start checking my phone. And by the time I looked up from my device, she was gone. She had left the room to go play with some toy outside because I was sending her a very clear message that whatever was on my device was more important than she was. And that's when I knew I had to reassess my own relationship with distraction. So I decided, hey, you know what? If I could have any superpower, a realistic superpower, yeah, it'd be cool to fly like Superman, but a realistic superpower, it would be the power to be indistractable, right? Like, what could we accomplish if we simply did the things we know we want to do, right? Because we all know, who doesn't. Do we really need more diet books to tell us how to diet? We know. Stop eating so much crap and get a little bit of exercise. And, for the vast majority of people, that works out pretty good. Do we not know how to do better at work? We got to do the work, especially the hard stuff that other people don't want to do. Do we need to know how to build better relationships? You got to spend quality time with people and be fully present with them. We know this stuff, but we don't do it. Right? That the problem we have is not a lack of information. We all know basically what to do. The problem we have in the modern age is that we can't get out of our own way. We don't know how to stop getting distracted. And so I wanted to figure this out for myself. And so I started 5 years of research and writing. Part of why it took me 5 years is because in the beginning I was very distracted and I was having trouble finishing. But then once I actually got into the literature and really looked at the psychology of distraction, as opposed to all this really misinformation that I think is out there about productivity and the source of distraction. Once I really got into what the psychology research says, it turned out to be much more fascinating, much more empowering than I think what is the typical line, which is, oh, it's all your phone's fault. That's what we all kind of think. Oh, distraction is caused because of these devices. Well, one of the first things I was surprised to learn was that Plato, the Greek philosopher, was struggling with distraction 2,500 years before the internet. People have always struggled with distraction. It's not a new problem. It's not created by our devices. I would argue it's probably harder today, that if you're looking for distraction, it's easier than ever to find. So the struggle might be more difficult, but it has always been part of the human condition. And so if we are to address distraction and become indistractable, I wanted to look at the root cause of the problem, not just the proximal cause.
I found it fascinating to read your references back to Greek philosophy. We, in our resilience research, were continually staggered about how much of this sort of groundbreaking research we've kind of known for 2,500 years. And I think you referenced the nature of acrasia, this sort of tendency to act against our better will or our better judgment, and the fact that the ancient Greeks were already bearing down on this and recognizing that this distraction concept was linked to this.
Exactly. Right. I think it just provides more evidence that it's not somehow a modern phenomenon, because you hear people saying this a lot. Oh, the world these days, the world's so distracting. And how can I concentrate because of Twitter and Facebook and my phone? And it turns out it's actually not a new problem. It's, as you said, the Greeks called it akrasia, the tendency to do things against our better interests. It's been around for a very, very long time. So that means it's part of our human nature in a way. It's something that we all struggle with. And thankfully, the fact that humans have accomplished as much as we have over the past 2,500 years, despite the fact that we feel distracted, kind of gives me hope that somebody has figured it out, right? In the past 2,500 years, people have made, they've written amazing books, they've written operas, they've made scientific discoveries. So some people are able to manage distraction. What's unique about those people? What separates the high performers, the high contributors from the people who constantly live their life going from one thing to the next and not accomplishing very much?
And so in your quest for this superpower of becoming indistractable, your research has identified that there's 4 pillars of becoming indistractable. Could you summarize them for us, please, Nir?
Sure. So let's start with the term distraction. What does that word really mean? Because I think it's a word that I at least thought I understood, but when I got into the research, I realized I didn't understand as well as I thought. So the best way to understand if you understand something is to ask yourself whether you know the antonym. What's the opposite of that thing? What is that thing not? And so most people, if you ask them what's the opposite of distraction, they'll tell you it's focus, right? I don't want distraction. I want to be focused. But that's not exactly right. That if you look at the origin of the word, the opposite of distraction is not focus. The opposite of distraction is traction. Of course it is. Traction and distraction, right? They're antonyms. They both come from the same Latin root, trahare, which means to pull. And they both end in the same 6 letters, A-C-T-I-O-N, that spells action. So traction, by definition, is any action that pulls you towards what you said you were going to do. Things that you do with intent, things that move you closer to your values and help you become the kind of person you want to become. Those are acts of traction. The opposite of traction is distraction. Distraction is any action that pulls you further away from what you said you were going to do, further away from your values, further away from becoming the kind of person you want to become. So this is not just semantics. This is really important because I would argue that any action can be traction or distraction based on one word. And that one word is intent. So these days you hear a lot of moralizing, a lot of medicalizing around how people spend their time. That somebody going on Facebook, that's morally reprehensible, but somebody watching football on TV, that's okay.
Yeah.
Why? Anything you want to do with your time and attention is fine. It's not up to anybody to tell you don't do that with your time. If you want to do it with your time, there's nothing wrong with it. As Dorothy Parker said, the time you plan to waste is not wasted time. So I want to give people permission to guilt-free watch Netflix, read a book, meditate, go on a walk, do whatever you want to do with your time, but do it on your schedule, not someone else's. Okay. That's an act of traction. Distraction, I would argue that the reason it's so pernicious is because the vast majority of distraction is not what people expect, right? People think, distraction is playing video games or going on social media. No, that's an obvious distraction. It can be if that's not what you plan to do. But the much more common form of distraction is when we think we are doing something that is productive and really it's a distraction. Let me give you a great example. For years, I would go to work and I would sit down at my desk and I would say, okay, today I'm not going to get distracted. I'm going to get to work. Nothing's going to get in my way. I've got that big project that I have to work on, that the slides I need to make, the RFP, whatever it is. I need to do something this morning. I'm going to do it. Nothing's going to get in my way. But first, let me check some email. Right?
Yep.
Let me just do those easy things on my to-do list. By the way, we can talk about later why to-do lists are probably one of the worst things you can do for your personal productivity. But let me just do those easy things on my to-do list because, then I'll get the ball rolling, right? I'll just get started.
And it's productive, right?
Yeah, that email is a work-related task. I got to do that sometime today. And what I didn't realize is that is the most dangerous form of distraction because it tricks you into prioritizing the urgent and the easy at the expense of the hard and important work we have to do to move our lives and careers forward. So just because it's a work-related task, if it's not what you said you were going to do with your time, it is by definition a distraction. So now we can start painting this mental model. So we have traction, point to one side. We have distraction, point to the other way. Now we have to ask ourselves, what prompts us to these actions? And here we have the triggers. We have 2 kinds of triggers. The easily identifiable trigger is what we call the external trigger. The external trigger these are all the pings, dings, and rings, all kinds of things in our environment that tell us what to do with some piece of information. Your spouse asking you for something, your boss interrupting you. These are all external triggers. They're outside of us, okay? Now, that is a source of distraction. That can definitely lead us towards traction or distraction. But it turns out studies find that is the source of only 10% of our distractions. 10%. So as much as people complain about their phone this and the news that and Twitter this and that, that's only 10% of the time we get distracted, studies find. So what's the other 90%? Turns out the other 90% of the time that we get distracted, it's not because of external triggers, it's because of what we call internal triggers. What are internal triggers? Internal triggers are uncomfortable emotions that we seek to escape. Loneliness, boredom, uncertainty, fear, stress, anxiety. These uncomfortable emotional states are the source of 90%, studies have found, of our distractions. Okay. So now we have these four parts of the model. We have the internal triggers at the top. That's where we have to start. That is step number one. Because what I discovered in my 5 years of research is that overwhelmingly, distraction begins from within. It is the desire to escape an uncomfortable sensation. Now, this is an icky, sticky truth that we don't like to think about, right? We like to think we got distracted because of something, but the vast majority of the time we're getting distracted because of a feeling, because distraction is not a moral failing. It's not a character flaw. It's something that we haven't learned to deal with comfortable sensations in a way that leads us towards healthy traction rather than unhealthy distraction. So step number one, you master the internal triggers or they become your master. Step number two is making time for traction. We can talk about all that involves. Step number three is removing the external triggers, hacking back those external triggers, and we can talk about how to do that. And then finally, step number four is preventing distraction with pacts. And so this is all about making what we call using a pre-commitment as a firewall, as the last line of defense to prevent you from getting distracted. So when you use these four techniques together, master internal triggers, make time for traction, hack back external triggers, and prevent distraction with pacts, anyone can do this. It sounds like a lot. If you just did one small thing in each of these four categories, it will change your life. You will finally start doing what you said you're going to do for yourself and living the kind of life that doesn't lead to regret.
So you stand by and whine. You all think you want to cry, but in the end you'll feel no pain. There's no afterlife but the sunshine through the rain.
Our weird bodies, Nir, however, are propelled on neurochemistry. And a lot of what you're talking about in terms of reward pathways, we're incentivized and rewarded for the quick wins, for the like, the retweet, to pick up the phone and see how many new followers we've got. Can you talk to neurochemistry inside that mix?
No. And I'll tell you why.
And neither could I.
And I'll tell you why. We way overdo it on the neurochemistry stuff. And I think there's actually a real danger to it. I'll tell you why. So I know all about the neurochemistry stuff. In both my books, I talk about it. However, it's really dangerous. And I'll tell you why. First of all, there's very little that we really understand. Okay. The brain is still very much a mystery. And so when we start to act like we really understand, how all these neurotransmitters make us do this and make us do that, number one, it's false. And it places too much weight on something that feels outside our locus of control. It feels like, we hear that one of the things that makes my skin crawl, and thank God you didn't say it, but a lot of people do, is the dopamine squirts, right? People check Instagram because of the dopamine squirts. Well, dopamine is released with just about everything. When you give someone a hug, you get dopamine. When you learn tennis, you get dopamine. There's all kinds. Dopamine is not cocaine. Okay, it's a whole nother thing. And in fact, there's a really bad neuroscience joke that what's the purpose of dopamine in the brain? The purpose of dopamine in the brain is to confuse neuroscientists, because it turns out dopamine does a lot of things. It doesn't make you do stuff. Okay, it simply reinforces the myelin sheaths around your neurons that reinforce the behavior so that you can learn an action. So it's involved in habituation, lots of things it's involved. It does not compel you. It doesn't make you do something. It doesn't make you into an addict in any way. But the popular perception and the reason people hold on to this notion is that when I can put blame on something else, right? It's Mark Zuckerberg making me do it because he's manipulating my brain chemicals. That leads to learned helplessness, right? I can't do anything about it. They're addicting me. because of the dopamine.
It's externalizing the locus of control.
Yeah, I like that locus of control link. We do talk a lot about that, and I've never thought about neurochemistry being an excuse. But yeah, it probably can be used as an excuse.
But one thing I have found, and stand fast whether it's the neurochemistry that's making me do it, but even just an understanding of, those kind of patterns in your brain, from a resilience perspective, it can really help. And for me, understanding, that's my old friend jealousy, or that's my amygdala firing. And I imagine with the internal triggers, you talk about sort of exploring those negative sensations with curiosity instead of contempt. I mean, even that understanding, this is my brain doing something. It's dopamine motivating me towards something, but it doesn't mean it's a self-fulfilling prophecy. It doesn't mean I have to do this.
Right. Exactly. I think that, so there's a right way and a wrong way to consider it, right? I think for many people, it becomes something that they're powerless in their minds to resist because it's so overpowering. And I think that type of attitude is very unhelpful, especially when you start throwing around, people, you didn't, but many people will toss around these terms like addiction. Well, addiction is a pathology, right? Addiction is not, I like it a lot, right? We're not freebasing Facebook. We're not injecting Instagram. We're not snorting Snapchat. We're talking about little apps on our phone, people. Like, we need to put this stuff in perspective. But when we have this attitude of, it's addicting me, right? Addiction, it does affect part of the population. About 3 to 5% of the population does struggle with addiction, but 97% of us don't. And so we don't need to compare ourselves to that because, one, it's very disrespectful to people who actually struggle with this terrible pathology. And two, it's very disempowering when we say to ourselves, it's hopeless, it's useless, I can't do anything about it, it's got control over me. Then what happens, right? It's like Henry Ford said, whether you believe you can or you can't, you're right.
You're right.
So it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy when we believe we're powerless. So that's why the book is titled Indistractable. Indistractable is supposed to sound like indestructible. It's meant to be empowering. It's meant to be, wait a minute, actually, there's a lot we can do about this, right? And in fact, people for millennia have overcome distraction by maturing, right? So there's lots of things that are natural to do that we overcome, right? So when people say, well, the modern world today, it's not natural. We weren't built this way. That these distractions are leveraging our worst instincts, and it's the lizard brain. By the way, there is no such thing as a lizard brain. Anybody who's actually in the field of neuroscience knows that that's complete rubbish. It doesn't exist. But we like to use these terminologies because they're very emotionally charged and they absolve us of responsibility. But there's all kinds of things, right? Like you had to get toilet trained. It's totally natural to defecate wherever you want. But you know what we do as civilized human beings? We change, we adapt, we learn, we overcome so that we and society is better. And that's exactly what we're doing with these distractions. We can use these tools to get the best out of these technologies without letting them get the best of us.
So between attraction and distraction is this zone of empowerment, maybe motivation, which relates back to the limbic part of our brain. Dr. Andrew Huberman talks about limbic friction. We've got to overcome these frictions to drive us to do things. The difference between what you say you're going to do and what you actually do, the bit in the middle is governed by limbic friction. How do we get motivated to push ourselves to improve?
Yeah. So it starts with understanding your values. So that's where it begins. But that's not where it ends.
Yeah.
It ends with turning your values into time. So let's spend a little bit of time with values. So I define values as the attributes of the person you want to become. And so I give people these 3 life domains to consider so that they can turn their values into time. Here's the thing. When we talk about motivation and distraction and people's plans and regrets, when we ask people, what did you get distracted from? Okay. What did you get distracted from? And you say, let me see your schedule. What did you plan to do with your time? Most people, most low performers, low contributors have nothing on their schedule. Nothing on their schedule. Maybe a doctor's appointment or a business meeting. But when you look at most people's calendars, it's blank. It's full of white space. So here's the cardinal truth. You can't call something a distraction from. So if your calendar is blank, you have no right. You got to say you got distracted because what did you get distracted from? There was nothing There's no plans. Everything is a distraction unless you know what you want to do with your time and your attention. So by turning your values into time, by saying the person I want to become spends their time this way, that's how we start using this technique called a time box calendar, which, by the way, has been studied. I didn't create this technique. It's been studied in thousands of peer-reviewed studies. It's called making an implementation intention, which is where we plan out what we're going to do and when we're going to do it. It is one of the most effective techniques you can use. Much better, by the way, than the to-do list technique, right? Because to-do lists have no constraints. You can always add more to a to-do list. And in fact, it has many negative repercussions in terms of our psyche, because the vast majority of people who keep a to-do list without keeping a calendar don't finish everything on their to-do list. And so what they do at the end of the day, when they look at that to-do list of things that have still not been finished, right? You're reinforcing your identity as someone who doesn't do what they say they're going to do, someone who doesn't live up to their commitments, loser. And so day after day, week after week, month after month, year after year, you're reinforcing this identity as someone who doesn't follow through on their commitments. And so that's one of the reasons that to-do lists are so bad for your personal productivity, as opposed to people who use the time boxing technique, where time boxing, what you're doing is you're not measuring yourself by how many cute little boxes you checked off. What you're doing is measuring yourself not by how much you finished. That's also not the right metric. What you're measuring yourself by is one thing, which is, did I do what I said I was going to do for as long as I said I would without distraction? That's the only thing that matters. It doesn't matter if you finish. It's, did I do what I said I was going to do for as long as I said I would without distraction? What I said I would. Okay, it's on my calendar. By the way, that can be doing work. It can also be spending time with your kids. It can be watching television. It doesn't matter. But did I do what I said I was going to do for as long as I said I would without distraction? Here's the kicker. People who use that technique, people who turn their values into time and stick to doing what they said they would do on their calendars, they finish more. They actually get more done than the people who use the to-do list technique. So by looking at these 3 life domains and filling out your calendar by first you, how would the person you want to become, that's the first life domain, how would the person you want to become spend time taking care of themselves? So what does that include? Time for exercise, time for meditation, prayer, reading, whatever you want to do. I'm not saying what you should do with your time. A big one, by the way, is sleep. How many of us who have kids, we tell our kids, you have to get to bed on time. Having a bedtime is very important. But do we have a bedtime, or are we being hypocrites? We all know how important. You listen to Huberman, sleep is super important. We've heard this to death. But do you have a bedtime? We need a bedtime, right? How simple is that? We have to have that in our schedule. So time for you. By the way, that time for you can also include playing video games or going on social media. I love social media. I have time in my calendar when I check it, though. I don't check it whenever I have the urge to escape reality, to escape my feelings, which is how most people get distracted by social media. No, I've got that time in my calendar, and it's perfectly healthy. So you are at the center of your 3 life domains. If you can't take care of yourself, you can't take care of others, you can't make the world better. So you've got to plan time for yourself. The second circle, the life domain, is your relationships. Part of the reason we have a loneliness epidemic in the industrialized world is that the traditional institutions that we used to have that provided for regular interaction with our friends have become much less popular. So as society in the industrialized world became more secular, we don't have the church group like we used to have. We don't have the Key Club. We don't have the bowling league. And Robert Putnam wrote about this in the 1990s in his book, Bowling Alone. We have to have those structures in our week, right? The regular interaction with our mates, with our community, with our family that is on our calendar. What tends to happen these days is that people give their closest relationships whatever scraps of time are left over. And that's no way to build a relationship. You have to schedule the time with the most important people in your life. The third life domain is work. And of course, this is how most people spend most of their day. But most people, especially low contributors, low performers, they spend their time 100% on what's called reactive work. Reactive work is the kind of work that's done reacting to things, right? Reacting to notifications, reacting to emails, reacting to phone calls, reacting to meetings. That's reactive work. High performers, high contributors, they spend at least some part of their day doing what's called reflective work. Reflective work is the kind of work that can only be done without distraction. Planning, strategizing, being creative, thinking, for God's sakes, can only be done without distraction. So what that means is when you make your time box calendar, of course, some of your time is going to have to be spent doing reactive work, but don't let all your time at work be reactive work. Plan at least some time in your day, even if it's 30 minutes, 45 minutes, some time in your day has to be set aside and protected for reflective work, or you're going to find yourself running real fast in the wrong direction.
Yeah.
So it's really about making time for traction by turning your values into time, having that time box calendar. That's step number 2 in becoming indistractable.
So if we think about those 3 things on a Venn diagram, you, relationships and work, it's very easy to see how the work circle could encroach upon you and your relationships. Any idea how to create that balance in the Venn diagram?
Yeah, so I actually think of it as 3 nested circles. So you're at the center, then there's the second ring of the of relationships, and then the third ring of work, because work can be encompassing of the 3. But if you don't start with that core of taking care of yourself, of putting those things on your calendar first, your relationship will degrade. And of course, your work will degrade. And so that's why a time box calendar is so much better than any other productivity technique out there, especially just using a to-do list. And by the way, I'm not anti-writing things down. That's a good idea. But what most people do when they keep a to-do list, that's all they do. They just keep the to-do list. So they forget the second step, which is to put those tasks in your calendar. So the way you protect your time and make sure that you have sufficient time for your family and your relationships and that you don't neglect those is that you put those in first, right? You put your bedtime 7 days a week in your calendar so that you know, okay, if I want to get up at 6 a.m., well, that means I need to be in bed at 10 p.m. the night before, which means I need to take a shower before, all the personal hygiene stuff. By having that on your calendar, and I'm not saying, time box brushing your teeth, put in 15-minute increments, let's say, or even 30-minute increments. That's fine. But defining for yourself what you want to do with your time is critical, because that's the only way you get any kind of feedback. So one of the biggest problems with just keeping a to-do list is that you have no feedback for how long things take you. And this is a major flaw, right? So we have what we call a planning fallacy. And planning fallacy says that we're really bad at understanding how long things take us. We're very bad at planning, that on average, it takes people 3 times longer to finish a task than they estimate. And part of that is because there's no feedback to teach us how long things take. When you keep things on a to-do list, write my novel, start a business, become a millionaire, have a great relationship with my kids, have 6-pack abs. Those are to-dos. But if you don't plan the time to do those things, you don't learn how long they take you. So when you say, okay, you know what, I've got a big project to work on, as opposed to finished project, which is on your calendar, on your to-do list, and you move it from one day to the next, to the next, to the next, to the next, until you procrastinate and then, have a deadline, then you rush to finish it very poorly. By time boxing it and saying, look, I'm not going to finish, but I'm going to work on this project for 30 minutes. That's it. Doesn't matter if I finish. I'm going to work on it for 30 minutes without distraction. Then what you can do is to say, okay, I worked on this project for 30 minutes. How far did I get? And then I could do some simple math and calculate, okay, if I finished about 20%, then I'm going to need 5 more increments just like this in order to finish the project. So that's how you use time boxing to start estimating how long things take you. Another thing that's very, and to your question about, how do you shut out other distractions? One of the biggest pushbacks I get about this technique is, well, what if my boss needs me? What if my clients need me, right? I'm in the service business. I need to be constantly available. Well, when you have a physical manifestation of a time box calendar, when you can show others your calendar, you can do what's called schedule syncing. And one of the best techniques that I've promoted is using this technique to sit down with your boss and say, look, boss, here's my schedule for the week. Okay. By the way, this takes 10 minutes. If you do this 10 minutes on a Monday morning, you sit down with your boss and say, hey, boss, here's my time box calendar. You see the calendar? Okay, here's where I'm going to have these meetings. Here's where I'm going to have time for email. Here's where I'm going to have time for that big project. Now, here's this other list of paper. Okay, you see this other list I have here? Here's all the things that you've asked me to do that I can't fit on my calendar at the moment. Can you help me reprioritize? So you're not saying no. By the way, one of the worst pieces of productivity advice, everybody's heard it. If you want to be more productive, learn how to say no. That's the kind of advice that only a tenured professor can tell you. That is the stupidest advice, because if you tell your boss no, you're going to get fired. So you're not telling them no. You're asking them, please help me reprioritize. And here's what you're going to find. If you show your boss that time box calendar, they're going to say, oh, you know what? That meeting is actually way less important than that thing on the list of things that you couldn't fit in. Can we swap that out? And so you're helping your boss do their job, which is helping you prioritize, and you're giving them transparency into how you're spending your time. And let me tell you, they will worship the ground you walk on, because most bosses have no idea how their employees are spending their time. So what you're doing is, and they won't ask you to do this because they don't want you to feel like you're being micromanaged. But if you do it yourself, you're doing what's called managing up, right? Managing your manager. Mm-hmm. And it will change your life. By the way, you can also do this domestically as well. So my wife and I, we used to get into fights about, domestic responsibilities, right? That my wife would say, hey, why haven't you taken out the trash? Or why haven't you fed fed our daughter, or all these things need to get done? And I would say, honey, if you want me to do these things, just ask. I'll do them. Just ask. And what I didn't realize is that I was giving her yet another job. Now she has to be my camp counselor, right? Now she has to be my boss. And so I was giving her yet another job. And we never have this fight anymore. Why? Because once a week we sit down and we do a schedule sync, and it takes us maybe 10 minutes. She has her calendar. I've got my calendar. We say, okay, our daughter needs to go here, and then I need to do this, and then make sure this. That 10 minutes of schedule syncing changed our life. We've been married 20 years. This is one of our secrets of success.
You mentioned so time boxing and the sort of, I guess, that pre-commitment of allocating those periods of time. You mentioned the transition times, those liminal moments where we transition between others. We love Adam Grant's concept of
psychological transition.
Yeah, third space. Adam Fraser, sorry, of having that deliberate break and that deliberate reconnect into the next one. You mentioned this is a potentially dangerous area for distraction. Any thoughts on ways to make that transition a little more effectively and a little less distractibly?
Yeah, so just to fill everyone in, so these liminal moments are these times between things. And they're not bad per se. What's bad about them is what happens if you don't stop on time. So, for example, you're waiting at a red light, and you think, okay, well, I've got a few seconds. Let me just check my phone real quick. There's nothing wrong with checking your phone, except when you do it at a red light and the red light turns green. Now you got a problem, right? You should be moving, and the person behind you is going to start honking at you. That's best case scenario. You might get into an accident if you're distracted at the wrong time because of one of these liminal moments. Another good example of a liminal moment is you're finished a meeting, and now you're on your way back to your desk, and you check email. And again, nothing wrong with checking email, but if you do it as one of these liminal moments between tasks, and then you say, oh my gosh, there's this thing I just need to respond to real quick. And then it becomes, 5 minutes later, 10 minutes later, 15, 20 minutes later. Well, now you've gotten distracted from what you plan to do for the day. So we have to be very careful of these liminal moments, and sometimes intentionally not give into them when we know we have a backstop. And this is, again, why time boxing is so important. When you time box, you know why you got distracted. And this is very important. So being indistractable doesn't mean you never get distracted. Okay, I made up the term, so I can define it any way I want. Being indistractable doesn't mean you never get distracted. It means you're the kind of person who is as honest with themselves as they are with others. You strive to work without distraction. Now, does that mean you never get distracted? No, I still get distracted from time to time. But the difference is that an indistractable person realizes why they got distracted, and they do something about it. So Paulo Coelho had a wonderful quote. He said, a mistake repeated more than once is a decision. I'll say it again. It's so good. A mistake repeated more than once is a decision. Distractible people decide to be distractible because they keep getting distracted by the same stupid thing. Okay, Facebook, terrible, so addictive, let's say. Okay, now what? How many times can we get distracted by the same stupid thing before we say enough? I'm going to do something about it. So a distracted person keeps getting distracted by the same thing again and again. An indistractable person says, okay, I see what you did there, distraction. You got me once, but you're not going to get me again, because distraction only has 3 causes. That's it. Every distraction is either because of an internal trigger, an external trigger, or a planning problem. That's it. That's the only source of all of our distractions. So an indistractable person knows that these 3 reasons exist, and they take plans today. They do something right now to prevent it from happening tomorrow.
One of the techniques you talk about in terms of just trying to nudge over that little attention grab is the concept of surfing the urge, which I've also heard used in terms of addiction therapy and that sort of thing. And my understanding is the idea is if we can sort of just park the urge for a few minutes, then it becomes much easier to resist. Have you got any techniques that have worked in your life? Should we be trying to distract ourselves from the urge with other things? I guess that's probably anti the Indistractable thesis, but thoughts on how to surf the urge?
Yeah, absolutely. So a bit of I guess semantics here. So people sometimes ask, well, isn't distraction good sometimes? Can't there be such a thing as a healthy distraction? And the answer is no. So by definition, a distraction is something that pulls you away from what intent you actually want to do, right? So distractions, there's no such thing as a good distraction. There is such a thing as a good diversion. A diversion is just a refocusing of attention. That's fine. And we pay for the privilege to be diverted. There's nothing wrong with, going to a movie to escape reality for a bit. There's nothing wrong with reading a book to really get engrossed. I mean, that's the whole joy of it. There's nothing wrong with any of these things. But again, that's what I intended to do with my time and my attention. So diversions can be very, very healthy. So for example, this surfing the urge technique is a diversion technique that can actually really help us get back on track and stay away from distraction. And so I didn't create this. This comes from acceptance and commitment therapy. And you asked what I do in my own life. And so this is a technique that I use almost every single day. It's called the 10-minute rule. And the 10-minute rule acknowledges, starting with the fact that the traditional techniques that we've heard around getting ourselves not to do something are not always effective. And what do I mean by this? The traditional technique to not do something is abstinence, right? You're trying not to smoke. Don't smoke. You're trying to lose weight on a diet. Don't eat the chocolate cake. You're trying on a digital detox. Don't do it. And it turns out that abstinence for some behaviors is a good idea, specifically when you can remove the triggers. So abstinence, if you're trying to do drug rehabilitation, removing those external triggers and not having it anywhere in your life can be effective. But you can't escape food. You can't escape technology, right? It's part of our life. The triggers are always there. So abstinence is not a good technique. Why? Because abstinence is like pulling on a rubber band. When you tell yourself not to do something, it's like pulling on a rubber band. You're pulling, you're saying, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. When you finally give in, when you finally do it, the rubber band doesn't go back to where it started. No, the rubber band ricochets across the room. And so that's what we find happens when we use strict abstinence. That when you tell yourself not to do something, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it, and you finally give in,
you go on a bender.
The reinforcement becomes the fact that you don't have to tell yourself no anymore. And it turns out this is a big reason why we believe that cigarettes are addictive. It's actually, we're finding less and less about the nicotine and about the brain chemicals, and more so about the fact that people who are trying to quit smoking are constantly telling themselves, no, don't do it, don't do it, don't do it. And then they finally smoke, which, by the way, explains why when people say, why do they smoke, even though they're trying to quit, it relaxes me. Well, that makes no sense. Nicotine is a stimulant. Why is it relaxing them? Because it provides them relief from not having to tell themselves no. So what you want to do is to not tell yourself no. What you want to do is to tell yourself not yet. Because when you tell yourself no, you're eliciting what's called psychological reactance. Psychological reactance is this instinct that we all have that when we are being told what to do, we rebel. So when your mom told you, put on a coat, it's cold outside, and your knee-jerk reaction as a kid was, don't tell me what to do. Or your boss tries to micromanage you, and you know how that feels, right? That's reactance. Now, here's the crazy bit. The brain experiences reactance even when it is our own minds telling us what to do. That's how crazy our brains are. So just because you tell yourself to do something, you may also experience a psychological reactance. So how do we disarm reactance? How do we disarm this rebelliousness in our own heads? The way we do that is not to tell ourselves no, it's to tell ourselves not yet, which is where this technique that I use all the time called the 10-minute rule comes in. The 10-minute rule says that you can give in to any distraction. So whether it's that chocolate cake that you're trying to avoid because you're on a diet, whether it's checking email because you're trying to get some work done, the 10-minute rule says you can give into that. You're a grown human being. You can do whatever you want, but not right now. In 10 minutes. So what I do almost every single day is when I'm writing and I feel these internal triggers bubbling, right? This is boring. This is hard. Is anybody going to read this? Is this any good? And all I want to do is check email for a quick minute or go Google something or go read some research that can take me out of the actual work I have to do. I tell myself, okay, I can do that in 10 minutes. So I'll set a timer for 10 minutes. I'll sit there for a second. And now I have a choice to make. There's a fork in the road. I can either get back to the task at hand, get back to my writing, or surf the urge. Now, surfing the urge acknowledges that these sensations, these uncomfortable emotional states, the boredom, the insecurity, the fearfulness, the stress, the anxiety, all the internal triggers that bubble up that we want to escape that lead to distraction, those emotions in the minute, they feel like they're always going to be with us. However, what we know is that these emotions are transitory. They're like waves. They crest and then they subside. And so we can ride these waves like a surfer on a surfboard. And so there's a certain script that we can use while we are surfing the urge that gets us through those 10 minutes. Now, what you will find is 9 times out of 10, when you allow yourself to surf the urge, you will very easily drift back into doing the work or doing the task that you said you were going to do. And if you, after 10 minutes, have that desire and you still want to go check email, fine, go do it. But what you will find is that because 9 times out of 10, this technique is very effective, it doesn't have to be 100% effective. What you're going to find is that you're building your own self-efficacy. You're proving to yourself, wait a minute, actually, I can wait out these feelings. I don't have to believe everything my brain thinks. I don't have to do I don't have to escape every uncomfortable sensation. And so what happens is over time, the 10-minute rule becomes the 12-minute rule, becomes the 15-minute rule. And over time, you're building your capacity to work without distraction for longer and longer periods of time.
Now, you've mentioned boredom a couple of times. It's something I find interesting, and certainly while Plato might have been distracted, he arguably didn't have the same level of stimulus that we currently do. Do you advocate scheduling in a time box session to do nothing, to allow yourself to get bored?
If that's what you want. If that's what you want. So we know that there's a very heavy correlation between the valence that we assign to tasks and their effect on us. What does that mean? So, for example, there was a beautiful study done that found that, we've all heard that there's, social media is bad for you, that social media is melting your brain and it leads to depression, anxiety, blah, blah, blah. Well, a study found that actually there's no correlation between how long the study participants spent on social media and how they felt emotionally and the symptoms associated with depression. What was correlated was how they felt about social media. So you could spend lots and lots of time online, but if you felt this was perfectly healthy and wonderful, no correlation with any kind of mental health symptoms. But if you believed that social media was bad for your brain, well, then you did have symptoms of depression associated with using social media a lot. And so the same goes with any task. If you believe that spending time being bored is good for you and you want to schedule that time, do it. But if you feel like, this sucks, I don't like it, I'm no good at it, I'm not getting anything from this, it's not going to serve you, which is why we need to stop with these blanket statements of, meditation is good for everyone. No, there's actually studies that find that meditation is not good for everyone. Yoga, everybody should do yoga. Well, no, only if it actually benefits you. It might be just as therapeutic for you to take a walk or play video games or do something else. It's about doing what you want to do with your time. The most important thing you can get from becoming indistractable is self-efficacy, is believing that you have the power to shape how you feel, how you think, and what you do with your time in your life. That's the most important gift that this gives you.
Nir, we're about to release our online courses for the Resilient Shield, and you wrote a wonderful article in HBR called How Customers Get Hooked on Products, which piqued my interest. How would customers get hooked on our online courses?
How would your customers get hooked on your course?
Yes. Yeah.
That's a whole nother discussion in terms of how we build products. The basics is actually using a lot of the same literature that informed what I learned about fighting distraction, also informs how we can build healthy habits. And it sounds like an oxymoron, but they're actually complementary, that I believe that we can use technology to build good habits in our lives and excise the bad aspects, the bad distractions in our life. So it comes down to making the kind of product and service that people use because they want to, not because they have to. Especially when it comes to online education. And again, I haven't seen your course, so this isn't a judgment on your course. I'll just tell you what I've seen work and not work out there when it comes to online education. Most online education subjects these poor students to something that is incredibly boring. and the reason it's incredibly boring is because they took an offline model, which is essentially, the what traditional education looks like, which is a sage on a stage, blah, blah, blahing about a subject that they're so knowledgeable in, and you students have to sit here and listen. Well, that kind of worked. It didn't even work all that well, I would argue, offline, but it kind of works because students have to sit there, right? You can't leave in the middle of a university lecture because you've got people all around you who are going to see you walking out of the room. So it forces you to sit in the chair. Well, with online education, and this is true for children as well as executives, there's too many options, right? This course is boring. This guy isn't keeping my attention. He's not interesting enough. So I'm going to go check some email, or I'm going to go on Snapchat, or I'm going to go do something else. So in an online setting, it's very difficult to sustain attention using the same methods of just someone, jibber jabbering at you. So I guess my best piece of advice is to make sure you keep it interesting, that you keep it engaging. And so there's a few ways to do that. One is the content itself. A second technique is to use cohorts. And so this is something I'm a big proponent of, is when we teach with a class, right? Teach with people who are keeping you accountable, who are keeping you engaged in that course. So more student discussions, more cooperative assignments, so that we're all doing this together, so that social aspect keeps people engaged. Now, this is very broad strokes. Again, I haven't seen what you're doing, but I think those are maybe some quick tips.
That's good. Back to the drawing board.
Yeah. Well, Nir, you've been incredibly generous with your time. I think we're creeping towards the end of the time box that you've probably got allocated for this chat. One last question, though, that we ask many of our guests. Do you have a power song? We're very interested in what sort of motivates people in a musical sense.
Okay, so let's see, a power song. It's hard not to think of anything but Eye of the Tiger when you say power song, but I'm sure I'm not the first person who said that. But I think, okay, so I'll tell you what I actually use. I don't listen to Eye of the Tiger when I'm doing work, but what I will actually use when I'm writing is I need to have music that I can't understand the words. Because if there's music, any kind of music where if it's in English, I can't concentrate. So I will either listen to classical, I'll listen to jazz. There's an app I use a lot called Endel, Endel, that plays like just random, I guess, computer generated beats. That would be my power song. It's just listening to something I don't understand.
Fantastic. Well, hopefully people will understand this podcast, because there was a lot of gold in there. Really appreciate your time and your candor and wisdom, Nir. Thank you.
Oh, my sincere pleasure. Thank you so much for having me.
Daddy, make my money.
Now to the debrief. We relentlessly pursue excellence and would love your insights and feedback. Also, if you know someone who is living a life less ordinary, let us know. You can get in touch with us at debrief@unforgiving60.com. That's debrief@unforgiving60.com. If you have enjoyed this podcast, please tell your friends and rate us on iTunes. You can also follow us on social media. Just search for Unforgiving 60 on Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, and YouTube. Until next time, we wish you luck in filling your unforgiving 60s with some quality distance run.